Hello everyone and welcome to yet another episode of Anyone Can Click, where we break down photography to its absolute basics, 1 week at a time. In the last couple of videos, we learned about the 3 tools of exposure triangle and we saw how they affect the amount of light in the photograph. We also learned about the qualitative impact that these tools have on the final photograph. Today, we are going to take everything that we have learned so far and put it on paper to learn the theory behind using the exposure triangle. So, without further ado, let's begin. A super helpful on-field reference guide of today's session is linked in the description box below. Click to get your copy. However, I do recommend you watch the video till the end for the guide to make sense. So we've already established the importance of getting the right amount of light in the photograph. But is there a way that we can measure this amount of light? There is. But the question to ask is a different one. Instead of asking how much light, the question we will ask is how much more or how much less. And there is a unit which is going to give us the answer to that. It is called a stop of light. When we say increasing exposure by a stop means doubling the amount of light in the final image, and decreasing the amount of light by one stop means cutting down the amount of light in the final photograph by half. And just to understand visually the impact of a stop of light on a photograph, I'm going to show you a series of images, each time either increasing or decreasing the exposure by one stop of light. This is all the information that we need to know and understand about this concept at this point. That too, because this forms the basis to understand the exposure meter scale. So an exposure meter is going to be our best friend, guiding us through the process of making a photograph, keeping us on track to ensure that we get the right exposure. It is what a speedometer is to a driver, a thermometer is to a doctor. It is going to tell us everything that we need to know about the exposure of the photograph that we are clicking. It is so important that you will find it wherever you look for it, through the viewfinder, on the LCD screen, and on the top LCD panel. This is what it typically looks like. To understand how to use the exposure meter, we're going to take a few examples. Now this photograph is clearly overexposed, and I could have avoided making this mistake if I just listened to the exposure meter. Because when I clicked this photograph, the exposure meter reading was tilted towards the right. This is the camera telling me that I may end up with an overexposed image. Now let's take a look at example number 2. Now this obviously is an underexposed photograph. Again, a mistake that could easily be avoided by just paying attention to the exposure meter. Because at the time of clicking this photograph, the exposure meter reading was tilted towards the left. This is the camera telling us that we are going to end up with an underexposed photograph. And finally, if the exposure meter were balanced to show 0, that is the camera telling us that we have got the right exposure, and this is the resultant image. However, the role of the exposure meter scale will depend on the mode that we are shooting in, and we will cover this in subsequent videos. But always remember one thing, that the exposure meter also can falter under certain circumstances. When does it get it wrong and why does it get it wrong? We will learn in the next episode, where we will cover metering and exposure compensation. This is where I'm going to bring back the 3 tools of the exposure triangle and our example number 1. This is an overexposed image. To avoid that, I have to cut down the amount of light, and I have 3 tools to do that, as we discussed in the last couple of episodes. The first one is Aperture, which controls the space for the light to enter. The second one is shutter speed, which is going to control the time for which the light enters. And the third one is ISO, and I wish I could say continuum, but I'm going to have to stick with amplification. Now, in the first case, I'm going to decrease the size of the aperture. Now, as we learned, in Aperture, less is more. Therefore, by increasing my f-stop number, I am decreasing the size of the aperture and less light now enters the camera. Now coming to case number 2. This time I'm going to make my shutter speed faster, because faster the shutter speed, less is the time that's available for the light to enter the camera. And finally coming to the third tool, which is ISO. This time I'm going to decrease my ISO, because decreasing the ISO means decreasing the amplification, which results in less light in the final image. And this is how the 3 tools of the exposure triangle can be used to get that perfect exposure that we want for our photograph. A similar process can be used when we want to increase the amount of light in the photograph. I'm going to leave you with a small tip. And if you've seen my video on ISO, you will know exactly why that is. When we want to decrease our exposure, always begin with ISO. First you cut down the ISO and then move to the remaining settings. But when we want to increase the exposure, when we want to let in more light, then you begin with shutter speed and aperture and then you move to ISO. We can use them to varying degrees and we can use a combination of different factors also. So which combination do we go with? Now that depends on the qualitative aesthetic of the photograph that we want. Do we want to freeze the motion, or do we want motion blur? Do we want a shallow depth of field, or do we want more of the photograph in focus and we want a deeper depth of field? All of these qualitative questions are going to define the final combination of the 3 tools that we are going to use. Now this brings me to another very important point. Not always will we want to control all the 3 tools of the exposure triangle. Sometimes we may want to delegate a part of that responsibility to the camera. And this brings me to a very important topic, and that is shooting modes. Now I'm going to spend 2 minutes and I'm going to clarify a very popular misconception in beginners, which I myself have been guilty of. And that is that being a pro photographer means using only manual mode. Now don't get me wrong, it is our aim to move away from the auto mode. But between the auto mode and the manual mode, there is a space of shared decision making, which are the semi-automatic modes. And today, cameras are getting so advanced that there's absolutely nothing wrong in using these semi-automatic modes to your advantage. It is not going to make you any less of a photographer, but the key is to know when to use them. Now there are different types of shooting modes, but we will be focusing on 2 shooting modes which we will be using most of the time. The first one is aperture priority. As the name suggests, the priority for the photographer here is the aperture. So we set the aperture and the camera takes care of the shutter speed. And the second shooting mode that we will be using is the manual mode, where the photographer will be controlling all the 3 tools of the exposure triangle. It may come as a surprise to you that 75% of the time I actually end up using the aperture priority, and I use the manual mode under certain special, very specific circumstances. Now naturally, the workflow, the way to approach the exposure settings will change depending on which mode we are shooting, which is why I have made 2 separate videos where I will be covering the details and the entire process of arriving at your settings when you're shooting in aperture priority mode and when we are shooting in the manual mode. This is going to be the practical on-field part of learning to use the exposure triangle. But there are some very fundamental topics that we will have to cover before we reach there. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have enjoyed this video, if you have found it useful, please do like, subscribe and comment. It greatly helps the channel. In the next episode, we will be covering metering and exposure compensation. Until then, take care. Bye.